Thank you. Thank you all for being here. This is the Democracy Forum. The Democracy Forum is an outcrop of Woody Bernhardt's organization called We Celebrate Democracy, Civil Rights for All. We've been running the Democracy Forum since 2017. Primarily, it got going in sort of response to Donald Trump and everything that he threatens democracy with. And so tonight's presentation is in line with that. Tonight's presenter is Tim Kipp, who is sitting beside me, behind me. Many of you, if not all of you, know Tim. He's been active in politics since the anti-war, anti-Vietnam War movement and the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which just, gotta keep count, over 60 years ago. He was a teacher here in town. He had a career of 39 years. Literally generations of Brattleboro family members were in Mr. Kipp's class. And sometimes it's fun to walk down the street with him and see how many people come up and say, "Hello, Mr. Kipp, how are you doing?" His success as a professor or a teacher and an activist comes from a very thorough, deep discipline of research, open-mindedness, and a vision of justice. In that vein, tonight's topic, the Supreme Court, becomes a linchpin. Tonight, Tim will describe the long machinations of numbers of players to turn the Supreme Court into a vanguard of the extreme right. That process has its own vision, one that may seem civil, but is really quite uncivil, and historically speaking, un-American. I think to set the stage, it's useful to refer to Viktor Orban, who is kind of a star of this movement, this right-wing movement. That Steve Bannon is another celebrity of this movement. Viktor Orban is known for having founded what he calls illiberal democracy, which he equates with Christian democracy. And I think it's the Christian democracy that the current court is directing towards. Orban calls Christian democracy equivalent to liberal democracy, and by definition, Christian democracy is not liberal. Liberal democracy is in favor of multiculturalism, while Christian democracy gives priority to Christian culture. Liberal democracy is pro-immigration, while Christian democracy is anti-immigration. And liberal democracy sides with adaptable family models, while Christian democracy rests on the foundations of the Christian family model. And so if you think of illiberal democracies or Christian democracy and the Supreme Court and its rulings, there's a certain confluence which has taken a long time for a lot of people to make happen. And that is the content of tonight's presentation, with which I will introduce Tim Kipp.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, folks, for being here. Some very familiar faces. Some students that still owe me papers are here. Just joking. So thanks for coming tonight. The drizzle before the storm. So I hope to keep you woke for this presentation. How about that? So yeah, I want to describe, as Nick has said, I want to describe how the right wing captured the court. This is not just a simple matter of a couple of years or one president who's conservative and then wants to appoint conservative jurists. It's a much more sustained strategy that really lasts for about 50 years. And this was a very conscious, concerted effort, and I'll try to explain some of that in the background. So this isn't the first time we've had a judicial coup, and maybe coup is not the right word for it. I'm thinking more of a realignment, maybe I don't like to overuse the word revolution. It's not a revolution, but coup implies something that'll be short-lived, and I'm not sure that that's going to be the case. Because of the infrastructure of what has been created by the right wing in terms of how you choose a Supreme Court, or how you manufacture a Supreme Court, all of that mechanism, and I'll mention again in the end of the talk, all of those mechanisms are still in place. And in some cases, they are even stronger than they were a number of years ago. Okay, so I'm going to look at the forces behind it, and as I'm going along, if you have questions, whether here or elsewhere around the globe or wherever we are, interrupt me, okay? I'd just as soon do that, and then that will maybe make it a little more lively. I'll try to make it lively.
Should we raise our hand?
What?
Should we raise our hand?
No. Just throw money. All right, so let me start with a description of what has been called by Michael Parenti, an old political scientist, a left-winger, reconstructed Marxist. He said that the Supreme Court is a supremely political court. Of course, we always have this image, and you're taught this, I hope not by me, taught that we have the three branches of government. They're equally balanced, and they will balance out, and sometimes one branch is stronger than the other. There'll be a resurgence and so forth. And that these all are all within a Madisonian notion of how democracy is supposed to work, checks and balances, so forth. When in fact, it is my view that the Supreme Court has never been part of the democratic process. The Supreme Court has always been what Jefferson called the despotic branch, a branch with unchecked powers. In 1803, in Marbury versus Madison, Chief Justice John Marshall took it upon himself to declare a certain enormous amount of power, a great deal of power, should be given to the Supreme Court. And that was what we call judicial review. Now, you may remember that in your days of education. Judicial review gave the courts the idea that the court could look at any law or any executive action and declare it unconstitutional, declare it null and void, and therefore should be discarded. Now, it's very interesting. There's nothing in the Constitution that gave the Supreme Court that authority. Nothing. You can't find a word on this. And Jefferson was the first to point that out as a leader of the Anti-Federalists. Well, and so that's why he called it a despotic branch, and he warned of how powerful and how inexorable it could lead to whatever that group in that body wanted it to be. Originally, I think the court was 5 in number, and it had gone as high as 15, but it's been settled at 9, not by anything determined by the Constitution, just by tradition and kind of a created precedent. I think the last time was 15. I think we had was before the Civil War. So Marbury versus Madison, in the hands of Chief Justice John Marshall, a Federalist, he anointed the court the authority to exercise control over what the elected bodies of the government should do. Remember, the Supreme Court is unelected, life terms, and they, to this day, do not have any code of ethics. There's no written code of ethics, and it can't be any clearer today than just watching the behavior of these political actors masquerading as jurists. So we have a conservative body that was counted on to buttress and to reinforce the status quo, the elite interests of our society. So over time, what did the Supreme Court do? It justified slavery, it abetted the destruction of native cultures, it enshrined corporate prerogatives over citizen rights. It institutionalized Jim Crow for 100 years, and it acquiesced to the imperial drives of the United States. Every time that citizens attempted to stop a war and appeal to the Supreme Court, they were rejected. They never even got heard. They destroyed workers' rights, they destroyed environmental rights, and they have, of course, enhanced and sustained corporate, economic, and political rights. So yes, Michael Parenti was correct in calling this the supremely political court, despite what the myths about American democracy are. The court has represented this elite structure and this elite interest throughout its history, with one exception. Anybody know what era that was? You can't answer this, Nick. The Warren Court. Okay, remember the Warren Court. What was the most important case in the Warren Court? Not one of the most, but it was a significant one.
Brown versus
Sure. 1954, and then another subsequent decision in 1955. Brown versus Board of Education. So a conservative Republican governor from California, appointed by Eisenhower, would preside when he would grow into this office, if you will. From 1954 to 1969, when he left the bench, he presided over the most liberal era in judicial history in the United States. And we are still paying for that, and I'll explain that in a minute. So conservative transformation over the past decade is qualitatively different than past shifts in the balancing of the court. This is more than a conservative president nominating conservative candidates. Since the era of Nixon in the 1970s, judges have become or have been more ideological, more political, and no longer are court nominees written down on a piece of paper in some political leader's kitchen, and rather there is a serious and concerted vetting process, which we know as the long game, to groom, promote the right people. So how did this systemic change occur? That's what this is about. So let me first talk about what I describe as the Great Backlash. What we have in the history, it's almost Hegelian in its nature, that when there is progress made, and there have been plenty of times in American history where democracy, because of people getting together and forcing the powers that be to change, there have been great victories won throughout our history. All right, I don't want to portray it as just this onward juggernaut of conservatism. However, for every surge, for every indication and any expression of liberalism or progress in whatever form you want to call that, there has been a backlash. There's been a retrenchment. There has been a pushback from the powers that are. So if we look at the 1950s, particularly the rise of the civil rights movement, also, which is not talked about much in conventional historiography, the rise of the anti-war movement, which was against the atomic bomb in particular, and then of course in the 60s, when a lot of us in this room probably got energized and politicized, like myself. So the activism of the 50s and 60s lay the groundwork for a great backlash. So African Americans in the 60s, you have women, and you have the beginnings of the environmental movement, all of the anti-war, anti-imperialist movements, all would foment a reaction by a powerful backlash. Who wanted these people wanted to redeem ruling class interests. If you look at black Reconstruction in the 1870s, what happened? We had the rise of Jim Crow. If you look at organized labor in the 19th and 20th century, or you look at the populist or farm labor movement, the progressive and socialist movements, the New Deal, and the post-World War II uprisings that I've made reference to, and certainly the Great Society, all engendered backlashes. All of these things I just mentioned are representations of what I think are the finer points of our history, of when people struggle to make change. Not for their own self-interest, i.e. for money, but rather self-interest in that we are fighting for a decent life, and we are going to do anything we can to make that happen. So in that context, it became clear to conservatives, and particularly around the Republican Party, but then not just the Republican Party, there are enough neoliberals in the Democratic Party to lay blame to as well, in my view. A strategy was developed really in the early 60s around the Goldwater campaign. Barry Goldwater, running in 1964, Arizona conservative, he became, he was vilified by the liberal press, but was quite well respected by conservatives.
Who is he running against?
Hmm?
Who is he running against?
Johnson.
Johnson.
Yeah.
I couldn't.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Goldwater and Goldwater's vice president, Miller. Yes.
There was a saying that the right used, the Republicans used, called "In your heart, you know he's right."
Yes.
About Goldwater, and then some smart ass from the Democrats changed it to "In your guts, you know he's nuts."
Yes, that's right. I remember. That's great. Wonderful.
Well,
Yes.
since we're doing that, the 246A, what do you get when you urinate? Goldwater. I'm sorry.
This is a family show, okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm only kidding. Only kidding. So what was developed so a concern was, well, how are we going to recapture some of our past glory, i.e. referring to the conservatives. And what was developed, and it wasn't really fully articulated in 1964, but it was started to be used, was something called the Southern Strategy. That became very dominant. Anybody here besides Nick talk about this? The Southern Strategy, and it was Nixon that really propelled it. Anybody want to take a stab at it? Very important to this process. The goal for the Southern Strategy was, we can see the demographics of our country. We know the Democrats themselves, the large D Democrats, have spread far and wide, and in particular from the era of the Civil War, the Democrats still reside heavily in the South. Well, we know, we've seen over time that Democrats in the South are not liberal. They have organically been conservative, and as the Democrats were, of course, supported the Civil War. They were the war party.
You could argue that they were not Democrats, they were anti-Republican.
Yes, better yet, because that's the way, one of the best ways to organize in America anyway, is it's not for what you stand for, but who you're against.
They called them Dixiecrats.
And by 1948, they were Dixiecrats under Strom Thurmond. And so so Nixon, in his wonderfully devious ways, will devise what will now be called the Southern Strategy, appeal to the historically conservative working class Democrats in the South, shift them to make them real Republicans. And in the game of politics, that's fair. I have no problem with that. Where I have problem with the notion of a Southern strategy is it's unbelievably cynical. It is unbelievably cynical, and it appeals not to what's good in us or good for people who want change, but rather the negatives. And Nixon was classic at appealing to the negatives, as the cult leader, what's his name, Trump is. So it would be appealing historically conservative Southern Democrats. However, the appeal would be based on fear, on economic insecurity, and racist predilections of the white working class in the South. So you're driving a system on division, not on bringing people together, but on division. And so when in devising this, the strategy was used to dehumanize by wielding the cudgels of white supremacy. Obviously, here we're talking about racism. This was a way to weaken the working class solidarity, whether you're in the South or the North, or where you're Republican or conservative, and also to undermine the impressive gains made in the 1960s, in the 50s and 60s, the Civil Rights Movement. So you have three major aspects to this, and it's a perfect reactionary trifecta. And Nixon was a master at this. He becomes the model for campaigns spewed forth over the internet and social media. Years later, of course, that would be Trump.
Tim, can you give a specific example?
Uh,
A specific example, just to... Yeah.
Yes, so things like, well, I'll give you something like what Reagan picked up on, the welfare queens, if you remember that term. So now they're vilifying people who were on welfare because they were really there to rip off people.
But Nixon?
So Nixon would be anti-communism, all right, would be one of the ones. Divide anybody who disagreed, who was mildly, or not mildly, was liberal or farther to the left, would be vilified as un-American, anti-American. He used war on crime, which also was always the code word for anti-black. You know, and in those days, you're really, and in today, although maybe less so now, you work in codes and code words to, when you're talking about this, the people that are listening that support you know what your real agenda is. We're really talking about minorities.
Would you include the silent majority in that?
Yes, I would, in that it says that our society, at that time, the silent majority, and these would be the white working class that were maybe going off to war. They were. They didn't get student deferments. They were part of a system that they have been alienated from this system, and it is the Democrats and those liberals that are deliberately alienating those particular offices. In this case, for the Supreme Court. In 1961, just as he was leaving office, Eisenhower was asked by a journalist, said, what was the decision you most regretted as president in your tenure in 8 years in office in the 1950s? And without hesitation, he said, nominating that damned Earl Warren to the Supreme Court.
Really?
The conservative government of California seemed like a safe bet. Now, he was supportive of interning Japanese Americans in 1942. And then, of course, as I made reference to, he went on to preside over the most liberal court in our history. But that was a betrayal. That betrayal surfaced again years later, as I mentioned earlier, when conservative presidents nominate justices who don't remain conservative enough. Sandra Day O'Connor, Anthony Kennedy, Reagan nominees George W. Bush's David Souter from New Hampshire, were by no means liberal, but they committed the sin of moderation. Can't do that. You cannot do that. This is how it becomes so much different than the old days, if you will. We will not tolerate ideological deviance. Those guys are deviant enough, but Jesus. And the lesson was learned. Extreme right ideologues would no longer countenance betrayals. You're a conservative, you have a conservative track record in the lower courts or as a leader and as a governor of California, whatever, but now there will be no more squishes, quote unquote, squishes. And you all know what that means. That's a standard political science term, right? Conservatives with moderate tendencies elevated to the high court. The powers that be and the people I'll be identifying a little bit more were absolutely horrified of these betrayals. At about this time, the term RINO, R-I-N-O, comes into being, capital all of those acronyms. And that is, you know what that is?
Republican in name only.
Yes, all right.
What is it?
Republicans in name only, that you're a RINO, yes. So to ensure that no more squishes would emerge, we had to reform the judicial nomination process. We had to advance new ideas. The new strategy needed a cover of secrecy. The Federalist Society and the cloak of darkness would come to the rescue. And this next section here is on dark money. Everyone know what dark money is, the term meaning?
Donations that can't be traced back to the donor.
Yes, and through highly sophisticated networks of diversion. The Federal Elections Campaign Act of 1971, was a barrier to the extreme right's master plan to capture the court. This law, weak as it was, set some limits on campaign contributions and expenditures and imposed some disclosure requirements. Where is this money coming from? Sounds like George Santos. As funding sources. These feeble regulations had to be scuttled. Leverage was applied, and according to one of the best people in this topic in the Senate is Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island. He said that thanks to favorable court rulings, quote, unrelenting pressure on the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Elections Commission, millions in dark money flowed into the long-term scheme to pack the court. And so through creative interpretations of IRS codes, such as 501Cs, and there's a number of variations on that, elite donors could avoid spending limits and disclosure requirements. I am supporting somebody, but I don't want anybody to know where that money's coming from. And starting in 1976, the newly evolving court would oblige. In 1976, we'd have Buckley versus Vallejo, which said that unequivocally that you cannot put limits on, or you can't impose unlimited limits on speech, because speech, political speech, meaning through money, is protected under the First Amendment. It's protected under the First Amendment because I'm giving you money, therefore that's my speech. I'm enabling that person to speak because I'm giving them money. I'm enabling them to run for office and to represent my views. If you say I can't give that, then you are restricting my First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. That was the logic, and then that logic became the groundwork precedent for subsequent decisions that I'll reference in a bit.
Like Citizens United?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So remember, at this point, Lewis Powell is on the Supreme Court when Buckley versus Vallejo was ruled upon. And as a matter of fact, he wrote the majority opinion. So money is speech and merited First Amendment protections. And then this would lead to disclosure, throwing out disclosures of where that money came from. So, as Terry pointed out, in 3 subsequent cases, most notably Citizens United in 2010, the court injected steroids into the Buckley decision. Chief Justice John Roberts did not see any quid pro quo corruption problems. So I give a lot of money, is that going to be a problem for a politician? No, it's all benign. I'm giving this with no strings attached. That was his view. In his vigorous dissent, John Paul Stevens wrote, quote, "The framers had enshrined the rights of free speech to individuals, not to corporations. This ruling is, quote, a rejection of the common sense of the American people who have fought against the corrupting potential of corporate electioneering," unquote. Supreme Court Justice, a moderate. As predicted by everybody but members of the majority on the Supreme Court, the political landscape would be transformed because of this influx of money. In 2006, only 2% of campaign funding came from undisclosed sources. 2%. By 2020, 40%. 40% fund what's going on, and I'll make some reference to that again in a minute from an article I read in the New York Times yesterday. In 2012, super PACs, which we're talking about here, independent donors spent $1 billion on campaigns, which was more than all the independent expenditures combined from 1980 to 2010. In one election cycle, 2012, more than a combined of 30 years prior to that. Has money, dark money, had an impact on the election process? I don't know, Chief Justice Roberts. You tell me. Now I want to talk about the Federalist Society. I think that you've all have heard of. This was one of the offsprings of the brainchild of the 1971 Powell memo, and what was created was an organization to foster this notion of capturing the court for the right wing. Funded by the likes of the Olin family, the Koch family, the Skates, and others, in 1982, this Federalist Society, or FedSoc, embarked on a patient stealth strategy to remake the judicial system. According to legal scholar Stephen Tellis, quote, "In no other area was the process of strategic investment by right-wing organizations as prolonged and successful as in the law," unquote. The Federalist Society really fosters a unique, novel universe of judges, scholars, politicians, lawyers, law schools to create an ideologically conscious, self-conscious court system on the state and federal and supreme levels. It's not just on the Supreme Court we're talking about here. We're talking about throughout the spectrum of the judicial system. And one of the organizers of this was a longtime judicial activist within the Federalist Society, but prior to being part of the Federalist Society, a conservative judicial activist by the name of Leonard Leo. I don't know how many of you have heard of him, but he operated his organization called the Judicial Crisis Network. And Leo became what I call the COO of the organization, the Chief Obfuscation Officer, presiding over a Byzantine money laundering spider web of two dozen organizations as front groups that dodge taxes and disclosure regulations. You create this whole web, complicated web funded by complicated money to propel and hide what you're doing in order to capture the court.
He's still doing it.
And it's still happening. So to give you an idea, and maybe you saw yesterday's New York Times.
I missed the article about Leo.
So Leonard Leo here is still at it. So he's been identified, of course, as very successful through a relatively new organization. He's saying, why can't we do to the rest of the political system what we did with the judicial system? So he's got $1.6 million in, ready for it, dark money. We don't know where it came from. 1.6 billion just recently to continue organizing, to go to reshape the political economy. Let me see if I can pick up some other things here.
Was it an op-ed piece or a news?
This is Michelle Goldberg. Yeah, an op-ed. Yeah. So that was in yesterday's paper. So,
The Sunday Times.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. From 2016 to 2018, Leo's congregation spent $580 million to curate their judicial nominees, or as someone referred to them as sock puppets. Political writer Tom Hartman said the Federalist Society's intent is to, quote, indoctrinate a new generation's legal system with Powell's mantra, corporate personhood is real, money is speech, democracy is mob rule, organized money should always have privilege over organized people. Accordingly, over time, the FedSoc web consists of over 70,000 practicing attorneys in 90 cities, and this data is about probably a couple years old, and over 200 law school chapters. And according to scholar Amanda Hollis-Bursky, observed that the Federalist Society, quote, has evolved into a de facto gatekeeper for the right of center lawyers aspiring to serve Republican presidents, unquote. So what we know, and one of the many takeaways from the Powell memo, is that the Supreme Court becomes absolutely critical to shifting the political landscape for the conservatives.
Really, all the courts, right? The appellate courts, the
State courts too.
Right.
Yeah, state, not only state, local, not like Brattleboro district, but, yeah. So now it appears that a nominee's integrity, legal talents, character, or judicial temperament are no longer salient characteristics of being a good judge. What is?
Loyalty to the party.
Yeah, to the party, paying to the party and the ideologues of the party. After the candidate is matriculated through the Fed Society's grooming program, the next step was public relations. How do we sell this to the Congress and to the population? How do we sell it how do we sell it to the mainstream mass media as well?
Of course, that's always been going on. Whenever there's been a Supreme Court nomination, there have been people to shepherd the.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, that's on liberal and conservative, that it takes, a whole apparatus and a campaign to get your nominee.
You're absolutely right. There's a difference, though. It has to do with the degree, the intensity, and the amount of resources thrown in that. Let me give you an example of that. With Leo at the helm, a barrage of high-tech hucksterism ensued using network TV, cable, social media, ads, op-eds, and talking heads. All right. This propaganda at its most potent. This is propaganda at its most potent. Senator Whitehouse concludes, or clarifies their motives. So why are they doing this? He said, quote, spending $580 million to capture the judicial branch was more cost-effective than continually throwing billions into two-year election cycles. And this is White House talking, particularly when the people you elect still won't do all the things you want them to do, unquote. So did this work? The money was well invested. Justices Thomas, Alito, Scalia, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Barrett, and Roberts were all Federalist Society graduates. 43 of 51 Trump federal judges were Federalist Society graduates. 43 of 51. That's a significant impact. And we're not just talking about, well, we're going to be up in 2 years. No, these are all life, as we know damn well, that these are life-term sentences. I mean, it's our sentence, not theirs. Another key element in this process, and then I'm drawing to a close because you are still woke.
Almost.
Some of us.
Almost.
His name's Woody, right?
Yeah.
What?
Woody didn't make it.
Oh, he's asleep.
Woody, where are you? Woody. You can't get, the picture's worth it, right?
It's okay, I took a picture for Maggie.
Yes, do take one. Starting in, no, that didn't work either.
Woody.
Woody.
Nah, he's in.
So, along a very, a key element in this process is Fox News, or I call faux news, the faux news network. Starting in 1992, the Fox News network, and I use that term news loosely, formulated a new level of low playing on the emotions to manufacture dissent based on hate, fear, and racism and xenophobia. Founded by international media mogul Robert Murdoch, and then directed by Roger Ailes, who was one of Nixon's attack dogs, Fox became an empire of unprecedented scope. Cable television and radio and online social media tentacles can reach, according to critics, 100 million people in a month's time. 100 million.
He's breathing.
He's got himself muted, so I can't do anything about it.
So what was happening was that Fox was selling not news, but ideology. It was selling, was an open to us, and they would never admit it because they were too fair and balanced, openly selling a right-wing agenda. A former Fox commentator, contributor, news anchor for 14 years, Tubin Smith, who I read his book a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, quote, "We now have a completely separate country within a country, digitally interconnected by God, guns, megachurches, and political, cultural, and religious televangelists spreading the word of white nationalism." It took him 14 years to figure that out, but we'll take it whenever we can. So religion and politics gathered at Fox, which then ordained the Republican Party as its church. In cult-like fashion, every Republican administration from Nixon on has effectively played on the insecurities of faith to advance their reactionary agendas. And that, of course, includes the Supreme Court. Along with that, with the Fox News, you have another cheerleader in Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell, as is well known, I won't spend a lot of time on this, the first thing that he said the day after Obama was elected was, "My goal is to make him a one-term president." And he has since then aspirated, quote, 100%, "I'm now 100% focused on stopping the Biden agenda," unquote. That's the kind of cooperation, that's the kind of collaboration, that's the kind of compromise that these people are offering. A shameless and adroit politician, the majority leader, leads the Republican judicial wars in Congress. When Trump took office in 2016, there were 107 judicial vacancies. Why? Because Obama didn't want to do it? No, they were effectively blocked by Mitch McConnell. And this is all, you all know this well, that in a Machiavellian milestone, even for McConnell, he infamously denied Supreme Court Obama Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland. Not since 1932, when President Andrew Jackson refused to follow the High Court's ruling favoring the Cherokees, has another branch been so brazen. As they said, as was said by Jackson, President Jackson at the time, he said, well, Chief Justice Marshall made his ruling, now let him enforce it. This is in 1832. McConnell will go on to inform his puppet, Mr. Trump, as much as Trump can be a puppet, in some ways he can because of his ignorance. He says that we're going to move judicial. He told in the first day of Trump's presidency in the White House, we're going to move judges like they were on a conveyor belt, appointees. Quote, to further this, we are making generational change that will repeat over and over again through the years, McConnell's saying. And he will reinforce what Lewis Powell said years before, that the courts are more powerful than Congress or the president. So they knew, and they intelligently knew where the power lie. Trump has appointed more judges. By 2019, Trump appointed in 3 years more judges than Clinton, Bush, and Obama combined. In 3 years compared to 24 years prior to that. And it's, you have to look for it. This isn't headlines. So the court is in fact captured. It is captured. I would argue that this is the most conservative court we've ever had in our history. The prior one that was probably the most conservative and pro-corporate was the Lochner era, from the end of the 1890s to about the 1930s, the Lochner era of where they were consistently pro-corporate in their rulings. It was property rights, it was free enterprise over human rights. Well, what we have today, according to Senator Whitehouse's staff research, the court has racked up an astonishing 80-0 business-friendly record. Of these cases, 78 were decided by 5-4 margins, which says that they were political, very political. Ideology was prevailing. Historically, what the courts want is if they have a very important case before them, they want a big majority. So you have Roe was 7-2. You had Brown versus Board of Education was 9-0. All right. Hell, even the Plessy versus Ferguson case, the notorious one, was 7-2. There wasn't a real close vote. So this new breed of radical conservatives have no compunctions about consensus, nor do they seem to have any reverence for stare decisis, which is honoring precedent. Court cases are based upon previous cases, and they try to conform whatever they can to these. Driven by more radical ideologies than judicial norms, these jurists show little concern for societal's impact on their decisions. The Dobbs versus Jackson decision is a good example. And a long time ago, social philosopher Eric Hoffer, who was very conservative, a longshoreman turned philosopher, noted years ago that authoritarian thinking, these jurists are their own true believers. They're creating their own universe of belief. And as effective as Republicans were, they had critical help along the way by Democrats. Miscalculation and acquiescence, neoliberal triangulation, strategy of moving Democrats to the center, eschewing the old New Deal, Great Society coalitions, and running to Wall Street for money. And certainly the Clintons wrote the book on that. Perhaps the most galling, I think, in this more modern era, is what Clinton and Obama did. They did something what I call preemptive compromise. They compromise with an intractable force and already compromise their own positions in clearly intractable forces. Their anemic policies on health care, the Democrats, workers' rights, high military spending, environmental protection, anemia, and regulation and judicial nominees, democratic vacillation yielded predictable outcomes. So I certainly blame the effectiveness, if you will, of the conservatives. And I blame either the lack of resolve on the part of the Democrats. So to all these essential mechanisms still remain in place. Even more extreme members in Congress now, the Freedom Caucus, which you have seen in action, and a solid 6-3 solid majority on the Supreme Court, challenges to democracy will still abound. Putting party before country and ideology before democracy, this is the new norm. Although I certainly I feel a little bit, because that's my nature, a little bit more optimistic with what Biden has attempted to do. We won't talk about the North Slope and what he's doing and about oil.
Yeah.
But anyway, so maybe this isn't with all this my perspective, and I'm a congenital optimist. I'd say, you know, it seems in American politics nothing lasts forever, but it sure seems like it. Thank you. A discussion doesn't have to be focused on my brilliance, even though it's endless. Yes.
I always believed in that the American judicial system is based on the collegial decision-making.
The what?
Collegial decision-making. But hearing today from you, it's not about collegial decision-making at all. It's
No, right
all
now it's not.
politically motivated.
Right, yeah, no,
Who
now
funded?
it absolutely is. Well, I would say it was less collegial, but more grounded in what honest interpretations and difference of opinion of what the Constitution was saying. Now, I don't see that happening at all.
At all.
I think it is the people that they've chosen, certainly the last three in particular, have been so vetted by the likes of Leonard Leo, and the Federalist Society, that you couldn't be considered a player or a potential nominee if you were not articulating
What a
those
shame.
values and those ideals that have nothing to do with Constitution. In my view, have nothing to do with constitutional principles.
It seems to me that, you know, the originalists on the court is the moral equivalent of the creationists in the Bible. You know, they're going back to, how can you possibly say that the people who wrote the Constitution and ratified it in 1789 were aware?
They totally were aware. You know they were, right? Jeez, absolutely. And I have said this many times as well, that their fundamentalism and this originalism, and if you're a fundamentalist and they're fundamentalists on this court, it makes perfect sense for them, because that's their worldview, right? That is absolutely, because their lens has nothing, in my critical view, having to do with a rational basis, a rational examination of what the Constitution says. And I also am absolutely opposed to this. I think it's a false doctrine, this originalism. And there was no one, there's no serious, in my view, no serious jurist or a judicial scholar that would argue that we have to source everything back to 1790s.
It seems to me that they're disappointed that we don't have a Napoleonic Code as the basis of our
Right.
society.
Yeah, I lean towards Hammurabi's Code more. But yes, I think your point is, I think, is a historically valid one, for sure. Yeah. Other observations?
Well, I'm glad you brought up Obama and Clinton, because I've seen time and time again, and not just them, but the left as being totally spineless.
Yeah.
And an obvious example, as far as I'm concerned, every time I hear on the radio or TV or anything about the precious life and we have to save life.
Yeah.
Most of these people support war.
Yeah.
And since World War II, our government has bombed over 32 countries. We've been responsible for killing hundreds of thousands of people, a good 80% civilians, just
Yeah.
men, women, and children
Yeah.
trying to live their lives. But I mean, these people feel justified. That they're really, I won't even, but who I get annoyed with are the Democrats that people like me vote in to stand up and challenge their intellect
Yeah.
and their values and their hypocrisy,
Mhm.
and you don't see that. And that's
I agree.
the burr in my spine anyway.
Boy, yes, anybody want to respond to that? I think that's well said, yeah.
Well, there are too many mansions and not enough Sanders.
Yes, right, yeah, for sure, boy. And that's very emblematic, it seemed to me. So you had two Democrats, conservatives, fine, they can be conservative if they want. That's their prerogative. But I think what the real danger is that we have a system that can be controlled by, and it only took one, you only needed his mansion and not cinema, didn't matter. That one or two people can really throw a wrench into the system. It seemed to me that a good democracy is going to have a much broader consensus requirement in order to take action, but we don't have that. We have an appointment system. We have a committee system that is riddled with corruption in terms of who gets to be on committees. You have a Speaker of the House who's way too powerful. You name it, and they become demigods, gods in their own right, and retain too much, sustain and retain too much power in order to play out whatever their vision of democracy is. It's a fundamental weakness, I think, in our system, fundamental weakness, and no one talks about that. Yeah. Anything else before we get snowed in?
We the people need to reclaim our republic.
Yes, right. Yes, yeah, right.
I'm just like very concerned about the Vermont judicial system because we just put in a Supreme Court judge who's 30. She's been a practicing judge for 9 months.
Really?
And she practiced in Brattleboro Family Court, and that was it. And she was just like a fill-in. She wasn't even appointed totally.
Uh-huh.
And her husband is a police officer who had racial biases and like was removed as a police officer for that.
Yeah.
And she defended him as a lawyer.
Uh-huh.
And then she got appointed to the Vermont Supreme Court and said that she just because her husband had racial biases doesn't mean that she has racial biases.
Mm-hmm.
And the POC community in Vermont raised this is a problem, and she still passed through even after that came fact. And she's 33, so she's gonna be a Vermont Supreme
Yeah,
Court
so
judge.
what's her name?
I can't remember.
Yeah.
I can look it up, but she's gonna be Supreme Court judge for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
With 9 months of judge experience.
Sounds like a Trump appointee. Yeah. Well, should we wrap this up?
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the questions and coming out and, yeah.
Are you gonna do this again?
We've been doing it for how many years now?
This is the fifth and a half, almost 6 years.
Of presentations? Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah,
I didn't even know that.
yeah. Well,
We do such a
we
great
try
job.
to try to keep it under the radar. This time, usually the Reformer has an article, a
Yeah.
decent article, and they didn't even have it in this.
Right, right.
Who knows?
Yeah.
I think it was bought out by Murdoch.
Or
By
Russian oligarch?
By
Russian oligarch?
an oligarch.